farmers and their families, March 1st meant moving day. And I always tell my husband Rich, I'm so glad that we don't have to move today on March 1st, but it's a gorgeous day. March 1st, or early March, meant the beginning of the spring term of school in the rural Midwest in decades ago. Well, even today, you know, the pattern of paying our Iowa property tax is March 1 and September 1. But for us, March 1 means the beginning of the Friends of the Harlan Lincoln House annual Brant Bag Series. And we always look forward to this so much. So welcome. We are so glad you're here. Thank you for participating. I know you won't be disappointed. The Harlan Lincoln House Executive Committee always looks forward to these learning opportunities each Tuesday noon hour in March. I'm Liz Garles, Chairman of the Executive Committee. I'd like to thank that committee. Tricia File. Oh, yes, wait. Pat White, Lee Bradley, Paul Jewell, Meg Rickman. Today's feature is Pieces of the Past, the Harlans and the Lincolns. It is presented by the director of the Harlan Lincoln House, Madison Pullis, and committee member Paul Jewell. Paul Jewell of Iowa City has been writing about Iowa history for the past 20 years. He's originally from Webster City. He holds degrees from the University of Iowa in history and the University of Northern Iowa in college student personnel services. Prior to retirement, Paul served several Iowa high schools and also a school in Switzerland as the school counselor and teacher. His reading audience has always been Iowans. Paul likes to connect the aspects of national and state history with our home state. He's an expert on photography and photography in the late 19th century, and he often includes many of those images from time periods in his books. The topic for his spiral-bound books are quite diverse, but they include the artists Grant Wood and Benny Ream, about country schools, a Pulitzer Prize recipient McKinley Cantor, actresses Sarah Bernhardt, but Abraham Lincoln's grandchildren is this most special book. We remember his Mount Pleasant memories, the James Harlan and Robert Todd Lincoln's families. Madison Pullis, our hometown girl, graduated from Iowa State University in 2017, has a BS in anthropology and minors in sociology and environmental studies. In between those undergraduate and graduate programs, she completed an internship in the paleontology department of the Virginia Museum of Natural History. She spent 6 months teaching English in Vietnam and completed an additional internship through the National Park Service at the Harry S. Truman National Historic Site. In 2020, Madison graduated with her MA in Anthropology and Museum Training from George Washington University in Washington, D.C. And while living there, Madison interned in the Anthropology Department at the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History. She participated in summer institutes and imaging projects during her time there. Madison has been the director of the Harlan Lincoln House since last April. Please join me in welcoming our today's presenters.
Thank you, Liz, for that great introduction. I also just want to take a couple minutes to thank all the people that helped put this together today. So thank you to National and the IT department for helping with the setup. Thank you to Courtney and the athletic department for our streaming capabilities on YouTube. Thank you to Meg and the rest of the marketing team, Kendra, Jen, and Justin for all of their help with marketing this event. And then thank you to the Harlan Lincoln House Executive Committee for all of your help, not only for this event, but over the past couple months. It's been invaluable. And finally, thank you, Paul, for all the help you've given me with this and for being so willing to share all the information. So I'll turn it over to Paul.
Well, thank you, Liz, and thank you, Madison. You know, I've been coming to Mount Pleasant now for about 25 years, and I've always been honored by the way the community, the Iowa Wesleyan University community, and the Mount Pleasant community in whole that has accepted me so well, and I really enjoyed doing anything with the Harlan Lincoln Committee over the years. The committee always been supportive, and we've been very fortunate in these years to have really three outstanding directors. Lynn Ellsworth, we worked with her during those years, Anna Villarreal, and now to have Madison, which is a special pleasure. I have to kind of say that I know, I think both Lynn and Anna are on Zoom today, and the Villarreal family is now 3 rather than 2, because last week Anna gave birth to Charlotte Vivian, and so they're watching. Even, we saw a quick photo, even Charlotte is watching today. So well, today Madison and I are going to be telling you some of the backstories that involve both the Harlan and the Robert Lincoln families. And some of you have maybe heard parts of some of these stories before, but we've tried to bring out some new material that we found of interest. For those of you who aren't familiar with how these families relate to Iowa Wesleyan University and Mount Pleasant, I'm just going to give you a quick fill-in here. The Harlans, a young family of 4, came to Mount Pleasant from Iowa City when James Harlan became an administrator with what is now Iowa Wesleyan. He was responsible for the building of Old Main and getting the college on its feet financially. Within a short period of time, he was selected as a U.S. Senator, the first Republican senator from Iowa, and the family moved to Washington, D.C., but made frequent trips home to Mount Pleasant. Later, Senator Harlan was selected by President Abraham Lincoln to become the Secretary of the Interior, the first cabinet position for an Iowan. Many things were done during the year he served in this position, including allowing the Meskwaki Nation to buy land in Tama County, Iowa. Well, while in Washington, the Harlan's daughter Mary fell in love with President Lincoln's son Robert, and they were married shortly after the Civil War ended. And they had 3 children, Mary, known as Mamie, Abraham Lincoln II, known as Jack, and a younger daughter, Jessie. The 3 children spent summers here on this campus and lots of other occasions with their maternal grandparents. Well, that's brief, I know, but it will give you a little background for what we will be discussing, and I hope you also picked up a family tree so you can kind of see, because we'll be jumping around a little bit with our stories. They're not in chronological order. But first, before the stories begin, we'd like to show you, Madison and I would like to show you 3 artifacts that have recently been donated or on long-term loan to the Harlan Lincoln House. Now, we're always looking for items that we can use to show the times in which these 2 families lived or spent time here. Over the years, Mount Pleasant residents have been very generous to us. We are very selective. We only want items that will help us tell our story, and sometimes have to recommend that the donor find another place for their desired contribution. So I'm going to turn it over to Madison, and she's going to tell you about the first of the 2 artifacts that are now part of our program.
So this first artifact is the dollhouse, and this is one you might be familiar with. It's in the process of being donated, so we don't currently have it at the house, but it will be there eventually. So the Boyd family has allowed us in the past to show this remarkable artifact here at the Harlan Lincoln House. We don't know as much as we would like to about the dollhouse, but suspect it was locally made in some field modeled after the Madison Street home of the Harlans, which is now the center portion of the Harlan Hotel. This might mean that construction of the dollhouse took place shortly after the birth of the 3 children. So the dollhouse was possibly built around the early 1870s. There were probably handmade furniture that went along with the house. And subsequently, the Lincoln dollhouse was written about in a 1975 book by Mary and Maeve O'Brien entitled Make Your Own Dollhouses and Dollhouse Miniatures. The dollhouse was used by the Harlan Lincoln grandchildren. So after the children had outgrown their plaything, Mary Harlan Lincoln gave the dollhouse to a friend, Sue Roper. The Roper family home stood at 519 North Main Street, where the PEO building now stands. In 1909, Miss Roper married Dr. C.J. Christensen, and by 1913 they had moved to Keokuk, where they resided for over 30 years. When the Christensens moved to California, and before they left, they befriended Miss Marian Dickinson. They gave the dollhouse to Miss Dickinson, who in turn stored it in her garage. Many years later, Mrs. Dolly Thiem, who was Miss Dickinson's sister, discovered the dollhouse. She and her husband were well known for the restoration and construction of dollhouses. And in an effort to maintain the original state of the dollhouse and furniture, very few alterations had been made. The tattered wallpaper has been removed and the broken furniture repaired. The dollhouse is currently owned by Mrs. Kim Boyd, who displays it in her Keokuk home. The dollhouse was given to Mrs. Boyd after the death of her grandparents, Mr. and Mrs. Thiem. Coincidentally, Mrs. Boyd's grandfather was Howard H. Harlan, the third cousin 3 times removed of Senator James Harlan. It's really quite unique for a plaything to survive for so long, as the dollhouse is nearly 150 years old. We are indebted to the Boyds for their generosity in sharing the dollhouse with us. So I have one more artifact to show before I give it over to Paul. So the second item is another you might be familiar with. In the past, this letter has been held at the Mount Pleasant Public Library, and we are so thankful that they have been willing to loan it to the Harlan Lincoln House for the time being. This letter, written and signed by Abraham Lincoln, was a thank you note to Harriet Snedeker for a box of peaches she had sent him. Harriet Snedeker lived in Trenton, New Jersey, and moved to Jersey County, Illinois, where her family farmed. Harriet's daughter, Catherine, eventually moved to Mount Pleasant, Iowa, after marrying William Hill in 1870. And together the couple had 3 children, John, Irma, and Harriet, who they called Hallie. The letter was likely passed down through the family until Hallie Hill Ott, Harriet Snedeker's granddaughter, donated the letter. The letter, dated August 13, 1860, reads in part, "Your kind note of the 8th, presenting a box of fine peaches with the compliments of the laughters of Abraham, was duly received, and for all which, on behalf of yourself and them, please accept my grateful acknowledgement. Yours very truly, A. Lincoln." The letter is now on display at the Harlan Lincoln House. Now I'll turn it over to Paul.
The third artifact that recently came to the Harlan Lincoln House is what we believe to be the earliest photograph of James Harlan, and probably taken just a few years after he left Mount Pleasant to assume the role of United States Senator. The image appeared in an auction house in New York, a well-respected auction house, and came out of a large photo album that had been put together by a man named John R. Johnston, who lived between 1826 and 1895. Johnston was originally a panoramic painter and had painted the portraits of notable Americans, including the presidents Andrew Jackson and Franklin Pierce. He was part of the Hudson River School of Art. Now, Johnston moved to Baltimore, Maryland in 1856, and at that time he became not only a painter, but he was also a photographic colorist in the Whitehurst Gallery. He then served as a colonel in the Union Army during the Civil War. So this is kind of the provenance of the image of Senator Harlan. The large album was kept in the Johnson family until recently, when it was broken up and the pages sold. A couple of interesting things to note in this photo. I'm guessing it might have been done just prior to the Civil War, so maybe 1858 or 1859. The first thing you note is the rather casual dress of Senator Harlan. Now, we have no reason for this because the main thing here is it's unusual to see a photo from this time period of a man with Senator Harlan's position to be dressed in merely what they call a waistcoat without the overlying jacket. And the other aspect that's rather unusual is the open buttons in the waistcoat. Now, some have speculated that several images might have been made at the same time, and perhaps in one of them or more, Senator Harlan had his hand or some of his fingers in his waistcoat. That was commonly done to show dignity, and actually goes way back in history. If you can picture Napoleon Bonaparte usually having the fingers in his waistcoat. There was actually an old myth that I think you might enjoy about the placement of the hands, arms, or legs in a portrait. And the myth said that painters charged more if a limb became part of the painting. Thus the old adage, it will cost you an arm and a leg. Now, some may have also applied this to this same myth to early photographers. At any rate, we're really happy to have this addition to our collection at the Harlan Lincoln House, and I know we will cherish it over the years. Madison?
So next we want to share with you some newspaper articles that help contextualize the members of the Harlan and Lincoln families before we move on to specific stories about them. So the following information comes from an interview with Mrs. Elizabeth Capps in October of 1931. She was at that time visiting her niece in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Miss Capps had many interesting tales of the years she spent in the neighboring house of the Lincoln family in Springfield, Illinois. She was 88 at the time of the interview, so would have been born around 1843. She claimed Abraham Lincoln to be kind, popular, and eloquent, although cursed with a nagging wife. Her recollections came from sitting on Lincoln's lap, brushing flies from his table, and chumming with his oldest son, Robert, or who she called Bobby. The first day Elizabeth Capps saw Mr. Lincoln, she was only 2.5 years old. But the memory is as clear and distinct in this white-haired lady, as if she had only been there yesterday. She said, "He stood in our doorway, hatless, coatless, his shirt sleeves rolled up, carpet slippers on his feet, and carrying a shovel with which to borrow some fire." In those early times, matches were scarce and expensive. Abe, a lawyer, was always a later riser than his neighbor, Thomas Lushbaugh, who was in the mercantile business, so he would come over to borrow a shovel full of coals with which to start the morning fire. There is only one time I remember when we had no coals to give him, and then Father offered him some matches. "Why, I never would have thought of matches," laughed the tall, gawky lawyer as he thanked his neighbor Tom. "He was so kind, so gentle, so patient," explained Mrs. Capps, as she described the big, lanky man who had to stoop to get through the opening of their front door. But Mrs. Capps' description of Mrs. Lincoln is not so glowing. Mrs. Lincoln also borrowed from her neighbors, not fire, but cream, and one day she sent her son over with a request for some thick cream. They sent her a generous pitcher full, and in 5 minutes the little chap returned with it to say that his mother said it was not thick enough. She wanted some that she would be able to cut with a knife. Mrs. Lincoln was nervous, high-strung, and irritable. Mrs. Capps said, "We were all quite used to seeing her standing on the front porch, wringing her hands and screaming that Bobby was gone, Bobby was lost, Bobby was killed." One day, Mr. Lincoln wrote to Father saying, "As I write this, I hear that Bobby is gone and lost and killed. And before you receive it, Bobby will probably be spanked and lost and killed all over again." Bobby Lincoln was Mrs. Capps' first playmate. Here is another Lincoln anecdote with which Mrs. Capps relates. A vegetable man sold some of his products at the Lincoln home one day, and when he returned the next day, Mrs. Lincoln berated him loud and long because, she said, he had not sold her fresh goods. The farmer was so angered by her upbraiding that he took his troubles to Mr. Lincoln, who listened to the complaint sympathetically and said, "I'm sorry, sir, but it seems to me you should be able to stand for 15 minutes what I have put up with for 15 years.
Well, I'm going to share a newspaper article that I found in the Sacramento Daily Record Union of April 29, 1882. Now we're jumping decades forward here to the time in which Robert Lincoln was serving as Secretary of War. And this is what was written in the California newspaper. The most interesting cabinet member, and by the way, these are, of course, the three Lincoln grandchildren. That's Jesse, Mamie in the center, and Abraham Lincoln II, Jack. This is what was written. The most interesting cabinet family to me is that of Secretary Lincoln, whose sweet wife was Mary Harlan, daughter of the Iowa senator and ex-secretary of the Interior. She is a lovely lady to approach, and she appreciates the sentiment of those who love her three children as Abraham Lincoln's grandchildren. They are Mary, Jack, and Jesse. I love to see them tumbling about the house, and to think of the pride with which the dead Lincoln would have regarded them. Just now they are all ill with the chicken pox. When Secretary Lincoln was told in the depot that President Garfield was shot, he removed his hat in a bewildered way, pressed his hand at the top of his head, and said, "My God, what misery I have seen in this town." Robert Lincoln is a kindly, boyish-looking man, more Todd than Lincoln, the wise old ladies say, for he is short and stout like his mother, and with his fair skin and brown hair, and with a full brown beard. He is an incorruptible man, and as strong a Secretary of War as is possible to have. He's arbitrary in his methods over the War Department and bends or breaks every new secretary that comes in.
So now I'll start with our first story, and this is related to most of the Lincoln family members, but it starts with Abraham Lincoln. So in 1958, Lincoln Isham, grandson of Robert Lincoln through his daughter Mamie, and great-grandson of Abraham Lincoln and James Harlan, gave Abraham Lincoln's gold watch to the Smithsonian National Museum of American History. It had been passed down to him and now belonged to the nation. Abraham Lincoln had purchased the watch in the 1850s while living in Springfield, Illinois. It was a fine gold watch and a symbol of his success as a prominent Illinois lawyer. Abe carried it in his clothing pocket as wristwatches only became popular after World War I. Soon after Lincoln was elected as President of the United States, he began having some problems with the watch. He took it to the M.W. Galt and Company shop on Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. on early April of 1861. The man working at the shop that day was named Jonathan Dillon. Many, many years after Jonathan worked on Lincoln's watch, his great-great-grandson shared a story that had been passed down through the generations. While working on the watch, Mr. Dillon had written some words inside and under the dial which couldn't be seen. After the watch was donated to the Smithsonian, Dillon's descendant asked whether they could remove the dial to see if the family story was true. The museum did, and this is what they found written inside the watch. I'm reading what it says here. Jonathan Dillon, April 13th, 1861. Fort Sumter was attacked by the rebels on the above date. J. Dillon, April 13th, 1861. Washington. Thank God we have a government. Jonathan Dillon. The watch was being fixed on the day when Washington, D.C. got word that shots had been fired on Fort Sumter in South Carolina. This marked the beginning of the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln had no idea that this had been written in his watch. It seems no one had seen the inscription before, and 150 years had gone by. It was a personal side of history about an ordinary watchman being inspired to record something for posterity. The watch probably had become the property of Robert Lincoln at some point in time. Robert came often to Mount Pleasant, and it's quite possible that the watch had ticked right here or right over there in the Harlan Lincoln house.
We'll be jumping around a little bit this morning, as I told you. And the next story, I think, is one you'll enjoy, especially after we see the reality TV series like Bachelor and Bachelorette and Married at First Sight and some of the others. I'm going to talk to you a little about the courtship of James and Anne Harlan, which of course took place back in the 1840s. So here we go. This story that I'm going to tell you was written in 1922, but it really reflects according in the previous generations. And it was written by a man named Johnson Brigham, who later did the biography of James Harlan. This story, of course, took place in Indiana, where they lived. Now, among the young ladies mentioned in James Harlan's diary for the college year 1844 to 1845, we find most frequent mention of Anne Eliza Peck, destined, of course, to be the devoted wife and helpmate of the future statesman and loving mother of his children. In this connection, the following entry in Harlan's autobiographical manuscript is interesting, not only as showing the success of the young lover's suit, but also as revealing the simple, honest directness of a man's nature. Visited, this is Senator Harlan speaking, visited Miss Peck in the evening and had a long, confidential talk with her, propounding numerous questions about herself and her views and purposes and preferences, intended by me to elicit information as to her sentiments towards me and freedom from commitments to anyone else. Now, her answers were frank and as I desired and hoped, and left no doubt on my mind as to her respect for my character and cordial friendship for me personally. At the close of this conversation, although no offer of myself was made or intended on my part or apprehended by her, yet somehow I felt that our relations had changed to more than cordial friendship. Well, soon this following interview is recorded. The important fact that then and there, Mr. Harlan came to the definite understanding with Miss Peck as to what their relation should become at some time in the future. Either the instinct of the educator was strong in him, or the desire to measure up to his attainments was strong in her, for an entry on June 16th records his engagement to hear Miss Peck recite 2 or 3 times a week in mental science, and also advanced studies not included in the course pursued in Miss Larrabee's school for the young ladies. He says, I gave her an examination on her preceding lessons in Umphen's mental philosophy and formed a very flattering opinion of her capacity. In the evening, following the commencement exercise, President Simpson gave a reception to the graduating class, but Harlan, weary and yearning for rest, started for home immediately after dinner. Finding his saddle horse had been loaned for the day, he returned to Greencastle and in due time appeared at the reception, much to the surprise of his friends. Mrs. Simpson, knowing of his engagement, rallied him on the impropriety of coming alone and ordered him to produce Miss Peck. The order was promptly obeyed. Following her graduation, Harlan returned home and was soon at work in the fields assisting his father plowing fallow land and putting in a wheat crop. Early in September, young Harlan returned to Greencastle by agreement to plan with his prospective wife for the immediate future. His frank and manly report of the interview is noteworthy. He explained to her his slender resources. He really had no trade at the time, no capital, no profession, and he had about decided to become a farmer, a vocation which he fully understood and liked. Well, the question presented itself. Was she willing to share with him such a life in an obscure country neighborhood? She responded with equal frankness that she liked the country, but when she engaged herself to him, she expected that she would make his own choice of a calling, and she would cheerfully abide by his judgment. When he asked her to fix a date for her marriage, she replied that she thought she could probably be ready in a year. He he insisted that a week or 10 days should be sampled, arguing that long engagements are proverbially unlucky. The lovers compromised on the 9th of the next November as their wedding day. Well, Mr. Harlan then returned to his work on the farm and later engaged to teach a 3-month school on Little Raccoon Creek near the home of his brother-in-law, David Reeder, with whom he made his home. But then on the evening of November 7th, he drove to his father's, and the next morning, with his 2 sisters, Lydia and Jane, and his prospective brother-in-law, Mr. Snow, drove to the home of Dr. Knight, his future wife's guardian, in Pleasant Grove, where the party dined. Mr. Snow, on his behalf, interviewed the clerk of the court, making the necessary preliminary arrangements for the marriage ceremony the next day. The party was generously entertained as Dr. Knight's, and on the following morning all drove to Hammond's Hotel in Greencastle. Here they were honored by a call from President Matthew Simpson. At 11 o'clock Sunday morning, November 9th, 1845, the party walked to the Methodist Church, where Dr. Simpson delivered an excellent sermon, and at its close announced that he had been requested to pronounce a marriage ceremony, asking the 2 parties, Anne and James, to come forward to the altar. The 2 were pronounced husband and wife, and after the benediction and the congratulations of their friends, the party walked back to the hotel. After dinner, the newly wedded pair drove to Father Harlan's home in the woods and entered upon their life together.
In January of 1862, in the middle of the Civil War, the youngest Harlan child received a photo and letter from Jessie Benton Fremont. Jessie Benton Fremont was the daughter of Missouri Senator Thomas Hart Benton, and after her marriage to John Charles Fremont, became active in California politics. In fact, Jessie Fremont was instrumental in her husband's 1856 presidential campaign, and though he did not win, his candidacy propelled him to a military position as head of the Department of the West during the Civil War. The Fremonts and Harlans were well acquainted. One day, when Jessie Fremont made a trip to Washington, D.C. to defend her husband's Missouri emancipation policy, she spent the day with the Harlan family, who were also living in D.C. at that time. Julia Josephine Harlan, nicknamed Jessie, was the youngest child born to Anne and James Harlan. Jessie was born in 1856 here in Mount Pleasant, though she spent most of her childhood in Washington, D.C., while her father was a United States Senator. Jessie Harlan's nickname supposedly was a namesake to Jessie Fremont, and the 2 exchanged photographs of one another following Jessie Fremont's visit with the Harlans. The elder Jessie wrote on the back of her photograph, "To my little namesake, Jessie Fremont Harlan, Jessie Benton Fremont, January 23rd, 1862. Jessie Harlan also gave a photograph of herself to Jessie Fremont, the photograph you're seeing up there. Sadly, less than 2 weeks later, Jessie Harlan died at the age of 6 on February 4th after being ill. Over 30 years later, James Harlan, the father of Jessie Harlan, received a letter from Jessie Fremont in 1895. The letter read, "I have often thought to send you this little picture of the handsome, happy child who spent a day with me long ago in Washington. You will understand the feelings with which I send my little namesake to her own people. I know that my name will always have its interest for you because of the dear baby who once answered to it." The letter also included the photograph Jessie Harlan had given to Jessie Fremont. The name Jessie continued throughout the Harlan descendants. Several years after Jessie Harlan's older sister Mary had married Robert Todd Lincoln, Mary gave birth to her 3rd child. The couple named their daughter Jessie Harlan Lincoln in honor of Julia Josephine Jessie Harlan.
Well, when you put together the names Lincoln and Booth, you usually think of a very unfortunate happening in American history, but there's another story that links these two names together. And Robert Lincoln probably wrote the most succinct account of an incident that had happened in his life. This was written in a 1909 letter to Richard Watson Gilder, editor of the Century magazine. The magazine had asked him to verify that the episode actually took place. Well, here was the incident. It occurred when a group of passengers were late at night purchasing their sleeping car places from the conductor who stood on the station platform at the entrance of the car. The platform was about the height of the car floor, and there was, of course, a narrow space between the platform and the car body. There was some crowding, and I, meaning Robert Lincoln, I happened to be pressed by it against the car body while waiting my turn. In this situation, the train began to move, and by the motion, I was twisted off my feet, and I had dropped somewhat with feet downward into the open space and was personally helpless when my coat collar was vigorously seized and I was quickly pulled up and out of it to a secure footing on the platform. Upon turning to thank my rescuer, I saw it was Edwin Booth, the actor, whose face was, of course, well known to me, and I expressed my gratitude to him, and in doing so, called him by name. Months after the incident, in 1865, Booth received a letter from a friend, Colonel Adam Badeau, then serving as an officer on Grant's staff. Lincoln had related the story of the rescue to Badeau while they were stationed in City Point, Virginia, and Badeau supposedly offered Booth his compliments for having performed such a deed. According to one Booth biographer, Robert's superior, U.S. Grant, also wrote to Booth to congratulate him on his heroism. Grant not only praised Booth's quick actions, but also said that if he could ever serve Edwin, he would gladly do so. Edwin reportedly replied that when Grant was in Richmond, the actor would perform for him there. While the rescue clearly seemed significant to Robert at the time, there is no existing evidence that he ever told his parents, Abraham and Mary, about it. This may not be too surprising, given that Robert and his father were not particularly close. The president, Robert may have assumed, had too many other things to think about. But of course, Edwin was the older brother of the infamous John Wilkes Booth.
So the matriarch of the Harlan side of the family tree, Anne Harlan was loved by many, not only amongst the people of Mount Pleasant, but also among the many American soldiers who knew of her role in the Civil War. She was a solid wife to James Harlan and a good mother to her children. As a little background on Anne, she had been born in Kentucky in 1824, and both of her parents died quite suddenly of the dreaded cholera in 1832. Their 7 children were orphaned, 1 son and 6 daughters. Anne was the third in the birth order. A few years after her parents' death, Anne immigrated to Indiana with one of her married sisters. She attended school in Greencastle and married James Harlan in the autumn of 1845 at the age of 21. They then came to Iowa in March of 1846. Though Anne and James had 4 children, only 2 survived to adulthood. Though while he was in his early 20s, Anne's only surviving son, William, died, leaving Anne and James with only Mary, their beloved daughter. Yet even through the grief of losing her children, Anne found a way to support the Union when the Civil War broke out in 1861. During the Civil War, she went through enemy lines to administer aid to the Iowa boys. Anne helped establish radical changes for the sick and dangerously wounded. She arranged for them to be brought to hospitals in the north where they could be closer to their families, and helped build bakeries that would supply bread made with flour instead of tack. Anne was even able to encourage more surgeons and physicians to come to the battlefields to help treat the wounded. But this story is about her death at Old Point Comfort, Virginia on September 4th, 1884. At the time, the Harlans were staying near Washington, D.C. because Senator Harlan was with the Court of Commissioners of the Alabama claims. Anne was only 60 at the time of her death, and James would outlive her by 15 years. But she had been in poor health for many years before. You see, on the 4th of March, 1869, Anne had attended the inaugural ceremonies for newly elected President Grant. As she made her way to her buggy, she was then 45 years old, the crowd was dense and she was almost crushed by 2 other buggies. She received injuries that led to painful illnesses lasting several years. Then, just a year before her death, Anne was in Mount Pleasant and the carriage she was riding in was hit by a runaway team. She was thrown on the frozen ground and inflicted internal injuries, which after another year of suffering from those pains likely led to her death. Following her death, Anne's body was brought to D.C. and veterans of the Civil War came to show their respect. On a Sunday, a former Union soldier appeared with his little 8-year-old daughter. He asked if he could show the daughter the face of what he called the woman who had been such a good mother to him at the battlefield of Shiloh. Anne's funeral was held in what is now the Harlan Lincoln House. Her body was brought back to Mount Pleasant, and those that attended the funeral sang, "Near my God to thee, and safe in the arms of Jesus." The carriages then lined up and took her to the cemetery where her body joined the plot of her 2 deceased children buried in Mount Pleasant, Willie and Jessie. Each member of the Grant Army of the Republic, which were Civil War soldiers, walked by her open grave and threw a sprig of evergreen into the grave.
This vignette I'm going to call Mount Pleasant's connection to Abraham Lincoln's glasses. Now, Abraham Lincoln was mildly farsighted, and he needed glasses. And he had several pair, but this one that I'm going to talk about was a zinc-colored metal with adjustable frames and open loop terminals on the bow ends. And they were housed in a leather-covered paper case. Well, after the assassination of her father-in-law, Abraham Lincoln, the glasses became into the possession of Mary Harlan Lincoln and her husband, Robert. And they brought them to Mount Pleasant, along with many other possessions during their summers and other times when they visited in the Harlan home here. One of Harlan's neighbors was a family named Lysenring. Now, the Lysenrings owned a photography studio here in town. They were really good friends with the Lincolns, and the Lysenrings took photos of the family when they were here in Mount Pleasant. Many of these are very rare, and some of them are of the 3 grandchildren of Abraham and Mary Lincoln. Their studio was in a couple spots on the square, but probably at this time it was on a bank building on the corner in a 3rd story, which has since been taken off. And that's the bank building that houses the Subway sandwich shop right now. Joe Lysenring was a member of this family, and he was the man that was really closest to Mary and the children. He attended the birthday parties you've maybe read about here at the Harlan home, and he and his brother ran the photo studio. Now, we're not really sure when the glasses were given to Joe, but we do know there is a letter written by Mary Harlan Lincoln that was written just sometime after the death of her son Jack. At that time, Joe Lysenring was moving away from Mount Pleasant. So the letter from Mary to Joe states, "You are going to leave us. Will you please accept this little book in remembrance of our dear Jack? You can see he has written his name on the flyleaf. You can put it away with the Abraham Lincoln spectacles that I gave you a long time ago, and so you have a little memento of the grandson as well as the grandfather. With all good wishes for your future, Mary Lincoln, Mount Pleasant, 26th February, 1894. Now, these same glasses were sold in 1985, and at that time had an estimated value of $20,000 to $30,000. By the way, Martha Hayes, and many of you remember Martha, a friend of mine and of many of you, said that when she was a student here at Iowa Wesleyan, that third floor had been made into kind of a rec center for students, and they called it the Skylight. And of course, that was because probably that old skylight of the licensing photography firm was still in place at that time. So an interesting story.
So this next story is Robert Lincoln's connection to not one, not two, but 3 assassinations. So on the evening of June 30th, 1881, President James Garfield was with a few members of his cabinet when he asked one of them a sensitive question. Would the man please recount for him the evening of his father's assassination? The man the question was directed at was Robert Lincoln, Garfield's Secretary of War and the only surviving son of the nation's greatest president. Lincoln gave Garfield a detailed recital, how he had been invited to the theater with his father that night but declined, how he was hanging out with friends in the White House when he heard his father had been shot, how he rushed to the house across the street from the theater where his father had been taken and tended to him until his father took his last breath. Though little remembered and often misunderstood, Robert Lincoln lived a remarkable life woven through with landmark historical events and spooky coincidences. Less than 48 hours after Robert Lincoln shared the story of his father's assassination, Garfield, too, was struck by an assassin's bullet, while his 37-year-old Secretary of War stood just a few feet away. On the morning of July 2nd, 1881, Robert was supposed to take a train to New England, but he had encountered a scheduling delay. So instead, Robert had come to the train station to let the president know he would join him the next day. He was standing on the train platform about 40 feet away when Charles Guiteau, who deludedly believed that he'd gotten Garfield elected and deserved a diplomatic post, shot Garfield twice. "I think I reached him in 15 seconds, Lincoln wrote to a friend later. He was lying on his back, his eyes closed, and with a leaden gray look in his face. A New York Times reporter commented on the incident and said that Robert had said at the time, "My God, how many hours of sorrow I have passed in this town." Robert helped the other cabinet members and the vice president run the country for months while Garfield convalesced, and though it initially seemed like the president would recover, his wounds became infected and he died on September 19, 1881. When the vice president took over, Chester Arthur, he replaced every member in the cabinet except for Mr. Lincoln. Years later, in 1901, President William McKinley invited Robert to the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York. Lincoln and his family had been vacationing in New Jersey and took the train to the event. When they arrived, a man handed Robert a telegram. It read, "President McKinley was shot down by an anarchist in Buffalo this afternoon. He was hit twice in the abdomen. Condition serious." Lincoln rushed to McKinley's bedside. Only one bullet had hit the president in the abdomen, and the other had grazed his arm. With treatment, he was expected to recover. After a second visit, Robert said, "My visit has given me great encouragement." And then Robert continued on his vacation. But, like Garfield, infection set in, and McKinley took a turn for the worse. He died on September 14, 1901, and was the third president to be assassinated. Vice President Teddy Roosevelt took over. Later, Robert sent Roosevelt a letter in which he wrote, "I do not congratulate you, for I have seen too much of the seamy side of the presidential robe to view it as an enviable garment."
Well, I'm going to talk a little bit about another name that we're all familiar with, Walt Whitman. And we call it the Walt Whitman controversy. Now, while serving as the Interior Secretary during the Johnson administration, you recall he was appointed to this position, Senator Harlan was, by President Lincoln. He also had a supervisory relationship with the famous poet Walt Whitman. Now, Whitman had served in the military hospital during the Civil War, so he was given the position of third-class clerk in the Indian Bureau of the Department of the Interior in February 1865. Well, Senator Harlan, or Secretary Harlan in this case, fired Whitman from a job he held in the spring of the same year, citing the need to eliminate positions in the interest of efficiency and economy. Whitman and others felt that Harlan was upset with some of the writings that he had found on or near Whitman's desk. Now, ironically, it was Walt Whitman who had written the really haunting poem about the paternal grandfather of Harlan's own grandchildren, Abraham Lincoln. And here is that poem. I'll read a little of it to you. There were actually two poems. One was O Captain, and the other one was When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloomed. But I'll read a few passages from O Captain, about Abraham Lincoln, of course. O Captain, our fearful trip is done. The ship has weathered every rack, the prize we sought is won. The port is near, the bells I hear, the people all exulting, while follow eyes the steady keel, the vessel grim and daring. But oh heart, 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 oh the bleeding drops of blood, where on the deck my captain lies, fallen, cold and dead. O Captain, rise up and hear the bells. Rise up, for you the flag is flung, for you the shores are crowding. For you they call, the swaying masts, their eager faces turning. Hear, Captain, dear father, the arm beneath your head. It is some dream that on the deck you've fallen, cold and dead. My captain does not answer. His lips are pale and still. My father does not feel my arm. He has no pulse nor will. The ship is anchored safe and sound, its voyage closed and done. From fearful trip, the victor ship comes in with object won. Exult, O shores, and ring, O bells, but I, with mournful tread, walk the deck, my captain lies, fallen, cold, and dead. Well, after the firing, after Senator Harlan had fired, friends of Whitman tried to make a really major incident out of it all. And they tried to portray Senator Harlan as one who came into the offices at night and read some of the writings from what was later called Leaves of Grass by Whitman, or something else he was working on at the time. And they kind of painted him as a repressive old man with no knowledge of the real world. And of course, some of the people, as is always the case, accepted this and rallied behind Whitman, and that damaged the reputation of Senator Harlan. But Senator Harlan never really spoke out about the controversy at the time, but he did write a letter here in Mount Pleasant at the Harlan Lincoln House, or the hotel, that did tell his side of the story. It was written to a Mr. DeWitt Mill, Union League, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, July 18, 1894. Now, Whitman was dead at the time. He had died in 1892. But here is the letter written by Mr. Harlan. Dear Sir, I am in receipt of your letter of 14th requesting me to give you the reasons for the removal of the late Mr. Walt Whitman in 1865 from a clerkship in the office of the Commissioner of Indian Affairs of the Department of the Interior. You must pardon me for suggesting that it has not been usual for the heads of departments of the national government to assign to the public, not to individuals for public use, their reasons for such official action, and that if they should so far forget the proprieties as they do so, such thoughtlessness would in many ways injure the reputations of the person they drop from public service, without being beneficial to anyone. But in this case, impelled by the desire to gratify your wishes, I think I may so far depart from the commendable usage as to say generally that when I entered the Department of the Interior as a chief, I found on its pay rolls a considerable number of useless incumbents who were seldom at their respective desks. Some of them were simply worthless. Deeming it to be my duty to administer the business of the department economically as well as efficiently, I endeavored with the aid of the heads of bureaus to weed out the needless and worthless material. Under this order, Mr. Walt Whitman and a considerable number of others were from time to time removed, as the same were reported to me by their respective chiefs for my action in the premises. It would not be possible for me now, after the lapse of 29 years, to recall in detail the reasons reported to me for their respective heads of bureaus, for their discontinuance in the public service, even if it were desirable and proper to recite them, after many of them, like Whitman, had passed on to the other side. It is therefore deemed needful only to say, in relation to his removal, that his chief, Honorable William P. Dole, Commissioner of Indian Affairs, who was officially answerable to me for the work in the Bureau, recommended it on the grounds that his services were not needed, and any reason was ever assigned by my authority. You are kind enough to tell me that the reasons given for this dismissal by his friends are favorable to him and unfavorable to me. I need only say on this point that according to my recollection, the same could be said truthfully of everyone so removed by me during my incumbency in the office of secretary. The least worthy usually raised the greatest clamor, making it clear to my mind that anyone who would seriously disturbed by such questioning ought not to accept the position as head of a department where he must necessarily perform such unpleasant duties. With great respect, your obedient servant, James Harlan.
So after James and Ann Harlan were married, they moved to Iowa, but they didn't immediately come here to Mount Pleasant. They first stopped in Iowa City when James took a job as a teacher administrator at a school called Iowa City College. It was affiliated with the Methodist Episcopal Church, and James and Ann found a small home at the corner of Lynn Street and Iowa Avenue in Iowa City. This is where it would be today. Eventually, they moved to a larger home on North Dubuque Street, and it was there that their son, Silas James, was born in 1850, the same year that James passed the bar to become a lawyer. Their little son died in infancy the same year he was born and was buried in Iowa City. He's the only Harlan family of the Harlans related to the house buried elsewhere. The Harlans had another son, William Aaron, born in 1852 while they were living in Iowa City. Unfortunately, James' position there in Iowa City didn't last long, but fortunately for us, he found a job as the president of what was then the Mount Pleasant Collegiate Institute, and he's the one who changed it to Iowa Wesleyan University. So now Paul and I have some photos we can share, and I also know we're running short on time. So if you have questions, feel free to ask us afterwards, but right now we'll go through the photographs. So the first will be photos of Robert Lincoln throughout his lifetime. Now photos of Mary Harlan Lincoln. so much for coming today. And again, if you have questions, feel free to come up and ask Paul or I. So thank you again for coming, and I hope to see you at the upcoming events we're having here.